Good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's Xtalks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Non-Alcoholic Fatty Liver Disease, the Importance of Patient Engagement in Improving Clinical Trial Recruitment. My name is Sarah and I'll be your Xtalks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive and webinars work best when you're involved, so please feel free to submit your questions or comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Syneos Health, who developed the content for this presentation. Syneos Health is the only fully integrated biopharmaceutical solutions organization. Their company, including a contract research organization and contract commercial organization, is purpose-built to accelerate customer performance to address modern market realities. Created through the merger of two industry-leading companies, INC Research and Inventive Health, they bring together more than 21,000 clinical and commercial minds with the ability to support customers in more than 110 countries. Together, they share insights, use the latest technologies, and apply advanced business practices to speed their customers' delivery of important therapies to patients. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Dr. Alistair Smith is committed to improving the outlook for patients with incurable and progressive forms of chronic liver disease, with the goal of reducing development of end-stage liver disease and its complications, as well as the need for transplantation and premature death rates among this group. Before joining Syneos Health in 2015, he was a hepatologist at Duke University and medical director of liver transplantation for more than 8 years. Currently, Dr. Smith works in the Medical Management and Scientific Services Group, focused on delivering outstanding medical monitoring services to clients working in this space. And our next speaker, Nicole Bass, is Director, Medical Management and Scientific Services at Syneos Health Wilmington, where she is responsible for management and allocation of departmental resources for approximately 168 medical and scientific personnel. Nicole also manages the MMSS Business Unit Financial Performance for over 250 studies. Nicole has worked in the clinical research industry for 6 years and has received her master's degree in clinical research and product development from the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Nicole has experience with process development, budgets, proposals, contracts, project management, and business development. Nicole has also served as the MMSS Business Unit representative for various corporate initiatives. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the presentation over to today's speakers, and you may start your presentation whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Sarah, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alistair Smith, and my colleague Nicole Bass is, if you like, standing by. The presentation that we're going to share with you in the next 30 or so minutes was given originally at the NASH Summit in Boston exactly a month ago. And as on that day, we took it in turns or went turnabout presenting material. Given that there isn't a distraction of people moving in a setting like this, I hope we'll be able to, as it were, pass the ball or advance the slides without disruption. In the first 7 or 8 slides, we're going to cover some key disease facts. This is not intended to be encyclopedic. The purpose in this section is just to give some idea of both the extent of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, particularly in the United States population, and also some of the key pathologic or histologic features and some of the downstream problems that patients with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease have to come to terms with. This slide in the left-hand part of, or this image in the left-hand part of this slide appeared in a New England Journal of Medicine review article about 9 months ago. It was published or written jointly by my former chief, Dr. Anna May Deal, and Professor Christopher Day from Newcastle University in the north of England. And I'd draw your attention particularly to panel C in this box, which gives some idea of the extent or epidemiological extent of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in the United States. So as a general estimate, and probably a conservative estimate, to at least 25% or 1/4 of the general adult United States population has non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Of that 25%, another 25% or another 1/4 of that group has what is referred to as NASH, or non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. Now, as we'll make clear in the next slide in the next couple of minutes, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis is that aspect or that part of the spectrum of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease which is characterized by liver cell injury, liver cell death, and eventual fibrosis formation and progression. So again, at a conservative estimate, somewhere between 3 and 5 or 3 and 6% of the general adult US population has NASH. And to put that figure in some sort of perspective, 3% of the general adult United States population is approximately 9 million, and there are approximately 9 million people who live in the state of North Carolina. So that's everybody in one medium-sized state in the Union. And if you wanted to look at it in another sense, it's probably most or all of the population of the City of London. And then if we go to the right-hand portion of panel C, some of that 3 to 5% of patients or individuals who have NASH will have cirrhosis, even if they know it or not, and in many cases they don't. And we can perhaps chat about that at in the Q&A session. And even worse still, some of those individuals who have cirrhosis as the result of NASH, or who have NASH cirrhosis, will have already developed primary liver cell cancer or hepatocellular carcinoma. There is a real risk of both premature death and or the need for liver transplantation amongst patients with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And the buckets of risk into which these individuals fall include ischemic heart disease. Secondly, the complications of cirrhosis and portal hypertension, sometimes referred to as end-stage liver disease. And as I mentioned a minute or two ago, hepatocellular cancer or primary liver cancer. And then lastly, and importantly too, a number of recent publications have confirmed that patients with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease have impaired health-related quality of life, and in particular they have significant impairment in both physical functioning and vitality. Until relatively recently, these assessments had been undertaken using a generic patient-reported outcome tool, for example, the SF-36, but more recently, a chronic liver disease-specific health-related quality of life tool has been developed, and this can be found in the Liver International publication, which I've referenced here. And this health or chronic liver disease specific health-related quality of life tool is now being used in a number of important phase 3 studies amongst patients with NASH. The two histology images in the previous slide were a bit small, so I've brought them up. These images were kindly loaned to me by Dr. David Howell, a former colleague in the pathology department at Duke University. In the left-hand image, which is stained with something called H&E or hematoxylin and ASIN, which is essentially looking largely at evidence of inflammation or injury. The blue arrow, which you see pointing upwards, refers to a large fat cell droplet within a liver cell. The two black arrows that are pointing downwards in this left-hand image are pointing to or identifying cells, liver cells, which demonstrate the entity of ballooning. So first of all, they become much bigger than they should be. For example, if we look at this cell where the mouse arrow is, and then look at this hepatocyte here, you'll see that a balloon cell is much bigger, for one. Secondly, the cytoplasm within that cell is rather rarefied and white. The nucleus, instead of being in the center, has been pushed to one side, and over at about 3 o'clock is what's referred to as Mallory's hyaline, which is further evidence of injury. And the similar features are seen in this cell here. Now, whilst these findings are they're not diagnostic, they're not pathognomonic of steatohepatitis or of NASH, they are critical to confirming its existence, and also important, very important for clinical trial management. On the right-hand image, or in the right-hand image, is a slide which is stained using a different stain called Masson's trichrome. And here the primary purpose of this stain is to identify scar tissue or fibrosis, which has formed and built up within the liver. And the scar tissue stains blue. So for example, here at 6 o'clock, and then up here at the tip of the white arrow, you can see a certain amount of scar tissue. And it's got with an eye of faith, I think, you can see that it looks rather like chicken wire. And this too, again, whilst not being diagnostic of steatohepatitis, is frequently found. Now, as we said a few minutes ago, patients with NASH are at increased risk of premature death, and one of the basis for that is the development or interval development of primary liver cancer. And these two images, again, kindly loaned to me by a former colleague at Duke University, demonstrate two things. First of all, in the left-hand image, in fact in both images, but I've marked it in the left-hand image, one can see that the contour or the outline of the liver, instead of being smooth, has a rather nodular and irregular appearance, and that is consistent with cirrhosis. Secondly, where the burnt orange arrow is in this left-hand image, you can see that at 12 o'clock there's a fairly well circumscribed lesion which is bright or contains more contrast than the surrounding liver tissue. And this image has been taken fairly soon after the injection of contrast into the patient's vein. And then on the opposite image, on the right-hand side, one will see that a few minutes later, the lesion which we saw on the left-hand side is still evident, but instead of being brighter than the surrounding liver tissue, it's actually darker. So what happened is that the lesion took up the contrast fairly quickly with respect to the surrounding liver, and it then released that contrast sooner than the contrast in the remainder of the liver. And this, or these two appearances here in a patient with cirrhosis, are diagnostic of primary liver cancer. And whether we like it or not, and I certainly don't like it, the incidence of, unlike many cancers, many solid organ cancers, the incidence of primary liver cancer is increasing, not only in the United States but elsewhere, and the treatments successful treatments for primary liver cancer, for the most part, are still lacking. Now, one potential treatment or intervention for primary liver cancer is liver transplantation, although that's not true for every patient who has NASH cirrhosis complicated by primary liver cancer, nor is it true for every patient who has NASH cirrhosis and complications of end-stage disease. But this image and the one that follows it are a pair, and they were taken from a publication last year of data gathered over an almost 15-year period from 2002 to 2015. And on this slide, what's shown are the absolute numbers of additions to the US or United States liver transplant waiting list for what's referred to as chronic liver failure or end-stage liver disease as the result of alcohol, NASH, and chronic hepatitis C virus infection. And you can see that in the first 10 years or so of the data collection, certainly for patients with hepatitis C, the number of additions was fairly stable. And then between 2012 and 2015, that number fell considerably. And the basis for that is the introduction of highly effective and well-tolerated antiviral therapy. During that same period, whilst there was a gentle increase in the number of waitlist additions for patients with alcoholic and non-alcoholic steatohepatitis with cirrhosis, one can see that in the years between 2012 and 2015, the increase in waitlist additions for both entities went up almost linearly, particularly for patients with NASH cirrhosis, such that in 2015, the number of additions for patients with NASH cirrhosis was almost identical to that of additions for patients with end-stage hepatitis C virus liver disease. And again, in this slide, this is the absolute number of transplants undertaken per year in each of these three disease indications: alcoholic cirrhosis, NASH cirrhosis here, and hepatitis C virus cirrhosis in the black diamonds, if you like. And again, one can see that by the time the data were censored, the absolute number of transplantations for NASH cirrhosis in this country was almost, or was very close to that undertaken for end-stage hepatitis C virus liver disease. So where do things stand? This is this slide and one other, and then we'll get to the meat of the survey. But so where in the year 2018 does disease management for patients with NASH and with NASH cirrhosis stand? Well, perhaps the first thing to say, and I make no apology for it, even though it's widely known and fairly depressing, is that there is or are no effective and approved pharmacological treatments available at present. A number of large phase 2 studies have been conducted in recent years. For example, the PIVENS study, which looked at the impact of pioglitazone, vitamin E, and placebo in patients with non-cirrhotic NASH, none of whom had diabetes. And although there was some evidence of benefit in those treated with pioglitazone and vitamin E, the impact on fibrosis was lacking, and for patients who were treated with pioglitazone, there was significant weight gain, which is an undesired outcome for this patient group. The Flint study reported its data late in 2014 and early in manuscript form in 2015, looking at the impact of obeticholic acid in a large phase 2 study. And likewise, the results of a large phase 2 study in patients with non-cirrhotic NASH receiving elafibranor was reported a couple of years ago. Those and other agents are in large phase 3 studies currently, and the outcomes are awaited with eager anticipation. So in 2018, disease management may consist of any or all or even none, as we'll see, of the following: weight reduction, diet and exercise. And again, as Anna Mae Deal used to say to us, these things clearly work, but it requires persistent effort. And as she would sometimes say, who would rather do weight reduction, diet and exercise when you could take a pill and be just as well off instead? There is some concern about long-term vitamin E use. The insulin sensitizing agents and the thiazolidindiones are only suitable for patients with type 2 diabetes mellitus. And even then, for example, the evidence of benefit in patients being treated with metformin is largely lacking. And then there's the issue of bariatric surgery, which is clearly a highly successful intervention for appropriately selected patients. But I believe it's still the case that as of now, the Cochrane database, not that it's infallible, has made or determined that bariatric surgery is not yet a treatment or a primary intervention for liver disease. So we asked the question, where do you stand? Where do I stand? What you see in the right-hand part of this slide are some of the responses, sort of ad hoc responses, which were provided by patients who participated in the online interview that Nicole's about to describe. Some of you have heard me say this, or some have heard me say this before, that the term cirrhosis is not, in some ways, is not a helpful one. It's certainly not as sexy. It's not, for example, or in contrast to patients with cancer, the term cirrhosis is not sexy, because if you ask most people, lay people, and even some medical people, what they think of or what they understand by the term cirrhosis, they'll tell you that the first thing that comes into their head is too much alcohol, or intake of too much alcohol. And the same might very well be true of the term hepatitis. So with that and a little bit of disease background, I'm going to pass the microphone, as it were, to Nicole, who's going to describe the survey which she undertook during last year. Nicole?
Thank you, Alistair, and good morning, everyone. In order to gain a better understanding of where patients stand, Syneos Health sponsored the creation of a NAFLD patient perception survey within an online NAFLD patient community. Today, we're going to talk about some of the themes that emerged from the survey. Patients were recruited via Health Unlocked, which is a technology company that builds and manages social networks within the healthcare environment. The final survey targeting NAFLD patients within the online community contained 38 qualitative and quantitative questions exploring patients' diagnosis history, disease understanding, care plan and lifestyle, information and support needs, and clinical trial participation opportunities or lack thereof. The results of the survey demonstrated that there is a complexity surrounding diagnosis, and patients are mostly being recommended diet, exercise, and weight loss to manage their disease. However, many patients are given no treatment recommendations at all. This lack of information given to patients results in a very poor understanding of their disease, including its causes, prognosis, potential treatments, and implications. The survey also revealed that these patients appear, in general, to be interested in the prospect of clinical trial participation, but they lack the information required in order to consider participating. We'll explore some of these themes in subsequent slides. However, first, we would like to launch a poll question.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Nicole. So this is our first poll question for the audience members today, and I'd encourage everyone to go ahead and vote on the poll. It's now showing on their screens. So this question is, comorbidities are common with NAFLD patients. Which of the following do you consider to be the most likely to exist? And I'd encourage everyone to select two responses here. So is it diabetes, obesity, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, or depression or anxiety? And again, that question is, which of the following do you consider to be the most likely comorbidity to exist in NAFLD patients? And it does look like the majority of our audience members have voted on the poll, so let's go ahead and close the poll for voting and share those results with everyone. All right, so 69% of the audience answered diabetes is one of the more common comorbidities. 76% said obesity. 7% said high blood pressure. 28% answered high cholesterol, and 31% chose depression or anxiety. So some interesting results there. Back over to you.
Very interesting. Thank you, Sarah. As you can see on the screen now, these were actually our results of the survey. So as you might expect, our results demonstrated that this patient population has high levels of comorbid conditions. 85% of patients reported more than one comorbidity. The most common comorbidities included obesity, high blood pressure, and depression and anxiety. This is truly a population health problem, as patients need to be treated for multiple conditions. The condition itself and the comorbidities make this a complex patient population, which makes treatment and total care for these patients complicated. What you may or may not have expected, actually, as the results of the survey that more than half of the patients in the study reported having and being diagnosed with anxiety and depression. In addition, patients reported high levels of anxiety when first diagnosed with the condition and reported that their anxiety continues to remain high. These results are consistent with a past qualitative interview study in chronic liver disease patients, which revealed that patients had a shared experience of uncertainty and anxiety because of inconsistent or lacking information given to them about the disease, which started from the onset of diagnosis and continued throughout their time living with liver disease. Another part of the complexity surrounding NAFLD is the inability to diagnose the disorder simply. In other words, on the basis of a single test or a couple of test results, which are both sensitive and highly specific. Most patients underwent ultrasound scan or CT scan of the liver and abdomen. However, needle biopsy of the liver, even in 2018, remains the only means of confirming the diagnosis of NASH, that entity on the NAFLD disease spectrum characterized by liver cell injury, death, and risk of disease progression. Liver biopsies are costly, time-consuming, invasive, and not without risk of injury, and are subject to interpretation limitations as well. Therefore, only 20% of our patient population had actually ever undergone liver biopsy. Although many patients in the survey did express concern about undergoing liver biopsy, very few patients had ever experienced one. Therefore, apprehension about liver biopsy may be due to perceived feelings of discomfort resulting from a lack of information or understanding of the procedure rather than an actual level of discomfort. However, it is important to understand that liver biopsy is often, not always, required in a clinical trial, so education about the role and proper place of liver biopsy would be very beneficial for this patient population. One of the most concerning aspects of the survey's results is that patients did not understand the lifestyle implications of the disease and how lifestyle could influence disease progression. Although diet and exercise were the most common treatment recommendations provided to patients, patients don't seem to be complying with those recommendations. Greater than 80% of patients reported being either sedentary or only somewhat active. In addition, only 13% of patients reported having seen a dietitian or having plans to see a dietitian. It is also important to note that approximately a third of patients reported receiving no disease management recommendations at all. There seems to be a failure in the system in the ability to provide appropriate guidance to help patients manage their quality of life and slow disease progression. It is also alarming that even though the most common management recommendation for patients with NAFLD is weight loss, almost 40% of patients were given no treatment advice whatsoever. When patients were asked how well they believed they understood NAFL, NASH, and fibrosis, less than a fifth of patients reported a full understanding of each stage of disease severity, and greater than 2/3 were not confident in their understanding of the disease progression. Furthermore, there is also little understanding of the impact of liver fibrosis, which is scar tissue within the liver, and how that influences prognosis, risk of premature death, and or the need of liver transplantation. Building upon the lack of understanding of disease progression, disease prognosis is also misunderstood. Less than half of patients believe that even the early stages of the disease, or NAFL, is reversible, and only 15% believe NASH is reversible. In addition, greater than a third reported not knowing whether either condition was reversible. Some patients even reported being told that there is no way to fix the liver. A recent cross-sectional study on illness perception and lifestyle modification in NAFLD patients found that disease understanding and self-efficacy are key factors in patient lifestyle adjustment, and that perceptions of a longer-term illness is linked to low self-efficacy as well as a less effective treatment perception. The study also found that disease understanding correlated to better dietary behaviors and exercise compliance. Now we're going to launch another poll question for you.
Yeah, this is our final poll question for today's webinar. And just as with the first, audience members can select 2 options when they're voting. This question is, if you suffered from NAFLD, what type of information would you want when working to control disease progression? There are 5 possible responses here. Again, please select 2. Is it, or would it be the causes of NAFL or NASH, potential treatments, my future prognosis, improving diet and nutrition, or reducing the load or burden on my liver? Again, if you suffered from NAFLD, what type of information would you want when working to control disease progression? All right, I'll just leave that poll open for one more moment here. And let's go ahead and close the poll for voting and share those results with all of you today. All right, so 29% of the audience today answered they would like to know the causes of NAFL or NASH. 77% answered they'd like to hear about potential treatments. 55% answered my future prognosis. 32% said improving diet and nutrition, and 65% answered reducing the load or burden on my liver. So again, some interesting results from that poll. Let's go back over to the presentation.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, that was very interesting, as that basically matched up exactly with what we found in our survey, as you can see on the screen. So although our survey points to a high lack of understanding, we also found a strong desire to learn more about how to reverse the disease. Information concerning potential treatments, prognosis, and reducing burden on the liver were the most desired by this patient population, as it was by you. Patients are highly interested in potential treatments, many of which are currently under development and available only in the context of a clinical trial at the moment. This desire to obtain further information on potential treatments suggests a willingness to participate in clinical trials. However, as you can see here, very few patients from our survey had ever taken part in a clinical trial, only 5 out of 256. However, nearly 85% of patients who participated in the survey reported either being interested in clinical trial participation or just not knowing enough about clinical trials to consider taking part. The main problem is that patients just don't know what clinical trials are and how to gain access to one or more. Although patients don't appear to understand the mechanics of clinical trials, when asked about participating in a clinical trial, many indicated they would be willing to participate in order to further medical research and perhaps have the opportunity to receive new potential medications. Free access to trial procedures and physician visits and assessments were also a strong consideration. What we've learned from this survey is that confirmation of the diagnosis of NAFLD or NASH is difficult and physicians have little to recommend once the diagnosis has been made. Clearly, treatment options are necessary. Education about the disease, its progression, which includes information about drugs and development, would be welcomed by people diagnosed with NAFLD and NASH. Given NAFLD is part of the metabolic syndrome, the healthcare community needs to focus on each of the components and the totality of a given patient's health. Lack of marketed pharmaceutical therapies, in addition to significant activity in drug development, should lead to clinical trial participation being a part of the standard of care until new therapies reach the market. As we all know, these trials will need to be designed with the patient in mind by utilizing sites convenient to NAFLD patients, as well as offering more structure, guidance, information, and support surrounding lifestyle improvements delivered alongside information on clinical trial participation. The industry should also consider promoting healthy lifestyle and altruism as motivation for participation. And now I'm going to pass it back to Alistair to talk about tomorrow's treatments.
Thanks, Nicole. So 2 or 3 slides about, well, maybe not so much about tomorrow's treatments, some of which I've already alluded to, but for example, on this slide, and again, this may be familiar to many of you, but there has been an almost exponential increase in the number of industry-sponsored trials in patients with NAFLD and NASH by period. So along the x-axis, you can see time periods here, for example, on the left between 2003 and 2010, then more recently up to the end of 2014, and then the last 3 years up until the end of last year. And the information here is almost certainly out of date. It's perhaps worth going back to the comments I made a little earlier about the Pivens trial. It was published in the spring of 2010. The Flint trial appeared in paper or in manuscript form early in 2015, although the results, I think, were published online during the latter part of 2014. The Golden 505 study, which is a study of elafibranor in patients with non-cirrhotic NASH, appeared in print form in 2016, and the Centaur study looking at the impact of CVC in patients with non-cirrhotic NASH appeared very recently. It's also worth pointing out that to piggyback on some of the comments that Nicole just made, that recruitment into NASH studies, whether it's in patients who have cirrhosis or patients who, or in a study that is for patients without cirrhosis, there's a heavy regulatory requirement influence, namely histology, particularly for at least for the first part of the phase 3 studies and also for the larger phase 2 studies, which is a considerable burden on patients. And then if one thinks at the longer term, in other words, clinical outcome trials, i.e. bad outcomes for patients with end-stage disease, whether that's a clinical complication of portal hypertension or the development of primary liver cancer, which we saw earlier, or the addition to a national liver transplant waiting list. Studies like that take the best part of a decade to do adequately and thoroughly. The second difficulty that's influencing clinical trial recruitment and participation is that this is a very, very busy space. The potential rewards are very great, and many companies are trying to recruit patients in the same space, in many cases at the same site. And I think, as many of us would agree, it's a sort of dog-eat-dog war in many cases. And then we've maybe not said as much about this point as we could have, but as with other forms of chronic liver disease, even patients with, I hinted at this earlier, even in patients who have cirrhosis but don't know it, there are a good number of patients walking about now who have chronic liver disease, whether it's NASH or some other form of chronic liver disease, and they're completely unaware of this for one reason or another. Here are some patient concerns about possible clinical trial participation which emerged during the survey. It was fairly clear that patients who responded to the survey in many cases had a strong bond with a primary care physician or primary care provider who was the focal point for their care. And perhaps the first thing to say is that if such a patient or person was going to participate in a NASH or NAFLD clinical trial, they'd like to maintain their connection or strong connection with their primary care physician where possible. It was also true that in a good number of instances, the primary oversight of abnormal liver tests, fatty liver disease, was being performed by a non-specialist, or at least not by a hepatologist, either by a primary care physician or primary care provider, or by a general gastroenterologist. In terms of convenience, as regards clinical trial participation, the costs, the inconvenience of getting to and from the site where the study was being conducted, these were concerns for patients. One of the questions which emerged was, could some data or some clinical trial information be collected using a mobile device, so that not all of the assessments would need to be performed at the site. And then, as you've heard both from Nicole and earlier from me, liver biopsy, or the prospect of undergoing liver biopsy, does hold legitimate concerns for patients. I would draw your attention to this middle bullet. My experience of doing many liver biopsies for more than a decade was that, where done well and with a good understanding of what to expect, and in the absence, obviously, of a complication, as a rule, most patients in those circumstances reported a generally positive experience. Some were surprised to find that they'd actually undergone the procedure. It hadn't taken nearly as long as they thought, and by means of, sort of gentle distraction, the liver biopsy needle could be passed and a specimen retrieved without difficulty. So again, here, as Nicole pointed out, education, consolidated education in advance may be able to allay concerns about this requirement. Back to you, Nicole.
Thank you, Alistair. You can go to the next slide.
Sorry.
It's okay. In partnership with Health Unlocked and the Fatty Liver Foundation, Syneos Health is working to create a digital intervention for those living with NAFLD. The purpose of this partnership is to create peer support methods with the goal of raising awareness about the need for better diagnostic strategies, education for both patients and physicians, and how the patients with the disease may participate in clinical trials. There are ways to participate by joining the coalition being sponsored by Health Unlocked and the Fatty Liver Foundation. We're currently in the initial pilot stages, and there's a 3-year plan in development. All of this we plan to launch later this summer. If you're interested in participating, please contact Health Unlocked or Wayne Eskridge, CEO of the Fatty Liver Foundation, and their contact information can be found at the bottom of the slide. So thank you, everyone, for listening. This concludes our presentation. We hope we've provided some useful information, and we're happy to take questions now.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both very much for that insightful presentation. As you said, I'd like to also encourage our audience members to continue to send in their questions for both our speakers today. We have received a few, so let's go ahead and get started with this Q&A session. Our first question, are non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and non-alcoholic steatohepatitis interchangeable terms, and have they the same implications for me as a patient?
Thanks, Sarah. The short answer is that they are not interchangeable terms. One way of thinking about it would be as follows. Every person, every patient who has non-alcoholic steatohepatitis or NASH has NAFLD. But thankfully, not every person who has NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, has NASH. The way I'd suggest thinking about those terms or breaking them down is to think of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease as an umbrella term, if you like, or as a disease spectrum going from left to right, or if you like, from top to bottom. But under the umbrella of the term or the abbreviation non-alcohol or NAFLD, at the good end or at the less bad end, we would have what's referred to or what's abbreviated as NAFL, in other words, non-alcoholic fatty liver, which is simply, and I don't minimize this too much, but is simply excess fat within liver cells or within hepatocytes. So there's excess fat, but there's no evidence of injury. There's no evidence of liver cell death. There's no evidence of fibrosis or scar tissue formation. And thankfully, because otherwise liver disease specialists, liver physicians, hepatologists would be completely overwhelmed if every patient in that position at the sort of good end or the better end of the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease spectrum went on from having too much fat in their liver to developing liver injury, fibrosis, and potential downstream complications. So non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is an umbrella term. Too much fat at one end without liver cell injury or liver cell death. NASH, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, is part of that spectrum. So somewhere between having NAFL, having too much fat in liver cells, but without injury or cell death, at some point a patient will start to experience, and of course they may not know this, they probably don't have any sense of it, but they begin to experience liver cell injury and liver cell death. And this group of patients are at risk of disease progression. In other words, further injury, scar tissue formation, more scar tissue formation, and eventually downstream complications of liver disease, such as primary liver cancer and premature death and or the need for liver transplantation. So the terms aren't interchangeable, and one represents a spectrum of disease, the other is part of that spectrum of illness or spectrum of disease.
Great, thanks very much for clarifying that. Our next question, this audience member writes, I thought that the diagnosis of cirrhosis applies to people who have an alcohol problem. Please explain.
Thanks for that question. You heard me say earlier that cirrhosis it's a sort of dirty word, and I mean that in a proper sense, in the best sense, but it's a dirty word or a misleading term because it's misunderstood for exactly the reason that the questioner has referred to. Cirrhosis, which is at a very basic level much too much scar tissue or fibrosis within the liver, and in a particular pattern, is a final step or a final common pathway for all causes or all etiologies of chronic liver disease. So it might be non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, it might be the end stage for somebody with an alcohol problem who has alcoholic liver disease, but equally it would apply to somebody who has untreated chronic hepatitis C virus infection and liver disease, or one of the autoimmune conditions such as primary sclerosing cholangitis, or one of the inherited forms of liver disease such as Wilson disease or alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. So cirrhosis is not, it's not specific to alcohol-related liver injury or alcoholic liver disease. It's as I say, it's a final step or a final common pathway regardless of the cause or the etiology of liver disease.
All right, thanks very much for that answer. Our next audience member writes, I've heard of lean NASH. How common is this? Usually you think of the link with obesity, but in lean NASH, what are the comorbidities associated with this?
Lean NASH is I suppose the difference is partly geographic, because lean NASH, for example, is found particularly in the Asian subcontinent, in India, and also probably further east in East Asia, in countries such as Korea. I'm not certain how common it is. There has, for example, in thinking about clinical trial setup and clinical trial management, there's been a lot of interest in whether or not, or amongst companies, whether or not recruitment should take place in countries such as India, where NASH clearly exists and where, for example, rates of type 2 diabetes mellitus are very high. It may be that lean NASH, I mean, it's clearly a different phenotype, if you like, a different overall appearance, at least on the basis that the patient isn't obese or overweight. And it may be that at an etiological level, there's something that's quite different about lean NASH from what I would refer to loosely as garden variety NASH, which we think of in this country and in Western Europe and elsewhere in the world. So I haven't answered the question terribly well. I think as far as the comorbidities most associated with lean NASH, I did refer to type 2 diabetes, probably systemic hypertension or blood pressure as well, and very probably abnormal lipids or dyslipidemia as well.
All right, great. Thanks for that response. Our next question, as a patient with cirrhosis as the result of NAFLD, what is my risk of developing hepatocellular cancer?
The short answer to that is probably somewhere in the region of 1 to 1.5% per annum. So for every year that goes by, your risk of, as a patient with NASH cirrhosis, your risk of developing primary liver cancer is about 1 in 100 or slightly more than 1 in 100, which those are not the worst odds, but it's certainly, it's not nothing, it's not nil or not next to nil. And it's on this basis that, and again, this is true for all patients who have cirrhosis, whatever the reason for this or whatever the etiology, it's vitally important, first of all, that these patients are identified as having cirrhosis, and secondly, that as part of overall management, and we didn't, in order to, concentrate on the survey's findings, we didn't deal with clinical management in a very comprehensive way, but it's vital that patients with NASH cirrhosis are first of all identified, and secondly, as part of overall management, that they're offered at least probably twice yearly imaging by ultrasound to look for a lesion or lesions which might represent primary liver cancer, because there's no question that patients are at increased risk of developing primary liver cancer. And as you heard me say earlier, primary liver cancer is on the rise, and effective therapies, for the most part, are still lacking.
Great. And our next question, what can be done to educate patients about clinical trials in order to get them to participate and to bring an effective treatment to market?
Excuse me, please. Thank you. There's probably a variety of different ways of doing this, and therefore perhaps no correct answer or no one answer that fits every set of circumstances. But clearly, in the context of overall care and overall management of somebody with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, particularly somebody who's been identified as having NASH and having fibrosis associated with that, or even NASH cirrhosis, it's important that as part of the overall care or the overall management strategy for that patient, unless he or she says otherwise, it's important that there should be some discussion about clinical trial participation or the opportunity in participating in a clinical trial. I suppose given that the space, given that the field is so busy and there are so many clients trying to bring new therapies to market, then I think it's safe to say that there's probably never been a better opportunity for patients with NASH and with NASH cirrhosis to take part in a clinical trial, despite the very depressing statistics that Nicole presented a few minutes ago. Now, having a discussion about clinical trial participation clearly depends on clinicians and healthcare providers being educated, being aware of what opportunities in the clinical trial environment exist and what opportunities exist specifically in their location or their locale, because it may be that, for example, a provider is well aware of 2 or 3 phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials which exist, but he or she is quite a long way from the nearest participating site. One of the, and I don't want to take up too much, but I think one of the things that became clear was a very good session on the Monday of the NASH Summit. There were workshops that day, and there were a couple of excellent clinical stream workshops, and a couple of the presenters at one of these described the necessity and the fundamental importance of creating strong links between a clinical trial investigative site, as he and his colleagues were, with a variety of local providers, anywhere from just down the street and around the corner to 40, 50, maybe up to 100 miles away. In other words, if one thinks of a wheel, the clinical trial site was the hub, and then there was this hub and spoke arrangement with a number of local sites. And those local sites might have included primary care physicians, diabetologists and endocrinologists who are looking after patients with blood pressure, with type 2 diabetes mellitus, and so on, and with local gastroenterologists as well. And in those sort of circumstances, the clinical trial, or the PI at the clinical trial site at the center of the wheel can do a great job and a great service, not only to his or her colleagues, but also to patients being cared for by those colleagues by providing education and regular updates, for example, a brown bag lunch, something like that, or, something in the early evening to provide an update about what clinical trials exist and clinical trial opportunities exist locally.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for those answers. We have now reached the end of the question and answer portion of this webinar. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for participating in today's conference. You will be receiving a follow-up email from Xtalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers for today, Dr. Alistair Smith and Nicole Bass. We hope you found this conference informative. Have a great day, everyone.